All right, welcome back. So, we've seen how primitive accumulation created this new class of agricultural workers, and of course, the capitalist farmer. But that leaves us with a huge question, doesn't it? A revolution on the farm is great. It creates millions of landless workers, but where do the factories to actually employ them come from? Well, Marx's answer in Chapter 30 is frankly a masterclass in dialectical thinking. He's going to show us that the very same act of kicking people off their land also, somehow, creates the raw materials and, this is the crucial part, the consumer market that industry needs to get started. So let's dig in and see how one historical process can do so much at once.
Okay, so this is really the central puzzle that Chapter 30 sets out to solve. Look, it's one thing to have a huge supply of workers ready to go. But if you're an aspiring industrialist, you need at least two other things, right? You need raw materials for your factory, and food to keep your workers alive, and, maybe most importantly, you need a market. You need people to sell your finished products to. Marx's big claim here is that all three of these things, the workers, the materials, and the market, all spring from the very same historical event. So here's how we're going to trace Marx's argument. We'll start with what he calls the Great Separation. Then we'll look at the central puzzle this creates. After that, we'll see how the solution gives birth to the home market, unleashes the means of subsistence, and finally, creates a self-fueling engine for capitalism.
First up, the Great Separation. We just need to quickly recap the historical stage that's been set here. As we've talked about all through this section of Capital, the absolute starting point for any of this to happen is that violent separation of the producer from their means of production. We're talking, of course, about the expropriation of the English peasantry from the land.
And remember, this wasn't some gentle, natural process. Marx is incredibly clear. He details a series of historical acts that he basically calls systematic theft. All this communal land and small-scale property that had belonged to the rural population for generations, it was just taken. And the result is a brand new class of people, the proletariat, who are totally cut off from any traditional way of supporting themselves. They have literally nothing left to sell except for one thing: their ability to work, their labor power.
And you know, what's so vital to understand is that this was not some abstract, hidden process that only historians figured out centuries later. No way. People at the time, people like Dr. Price, who's quoted here, they saw it happening in real time. They understood this wasn't just evolution. It was a violent transformation that created a new class of people whose very survival now depended entirely on finding someone to hire them. All right, Section 2, Capitalism's Central Puzzle. So this great separation creates what looks like a major problem for industrial capital. You've created the workers, sure, but you also have to create the very conditions for them to work and for them to buy things. And Marx's solution is just a brilliant piece of dialectical insight. So think for a second about how things used to work. A peasant family was pretty much its own little self-contained economic universe. They grew their own food, they raised sheep for wool, grew flax for linen, and they spun and wove it themselves. The complete and utter destruction of this self-sufficient household, that is the key to solving our puzzle. And this brings us to one of Marx's most famous and most ironic concepts, this idea of double freedom. So on the one hand, the rural worker is set free from the soil. But what does that really mean? It's a negative kind of freedom. They're also set free from their tools, their home, from any way of making a living on their own. So they're free in two senses. They're free to sell their own labor power, and they are free from owning anything else. Now this is the other half of the dialectic, the part that's less obvious but just as critical. It's not just the people who are set free. The things they used to produce and own, the food, the flax, the wool, those are also torn away from the family unit. They stop being things for personal use and they become commodities, things to be bought and sold on the open market. And they're now just sitting there, waiting for an industrial capitalist to come and buy them. Okay, Part 3, Birth of the Home Market. So creating this huge new class of people who own nothing directly solves capital's first big problem. Where do you find the demand? Where do you find the customers? Well, the answer is ingenious. The people who were kicked off the land, they become the new market.
The logic here is pretty much inescapable when you lay it out. You used to have millions of small producers making their own stuff. Now, you have millions of wage earners who have to go to the market to buy literally everything they need. Food, clothes, you name it. And just like that, you've transformed millions of tiny, independent households into one giant, consolidated market of consumers, a perfect customer base for industrial capital.
Yeah, just think about yarn and cloth. Before, it was spun and woven in thousands of little cottages all over the countryside. Now, it's all being made in big, centralized factories.
As Marx put it, the destruction of those rural handicrafts is exactly what gives the internal market the scale and stability that capitalism needs. The whole factory system quite literally rises from the ashes of that old domestic system.
All right, next section. Let's look at the other side of this. We've solved the problem of demand, but what about supply? How does the freeing of raw materials and food provide the actual stuff that industry needs? I mean, it's not enough to have workers and customers. The capitalist needs inputs for the factory itself. And this is where we see the final destination for all those things that were set free. Take the food the peasant used to grow and eat. It's now a commodity that the capitalist buys to pay wages. Marx has a specific name for this, variable capital, because the labor power it buys is the unique thing that can create new value. Then you have the flax and the wool. Those are now raw materials for the factory. Marx calls this constant capital, because their value is just passed along to the final product. It doesn't grow. So you see, the peasant's entire former way of life is literally broken down into its component parts and then reassembled as the building blocks of industrial capital.
And this quote right here, this nails the core of Marx's whole argument. He insists that we have to see this as a single, unified movement. It's not a sequence of events, like first you get workers, then you find materials, then you build a market. No, the creation of the free worker is the creation of the home market. It's one and the same process.
Okay, final section, let's bring it all together. Let's see how these two threads combine to create this incredible, self-reinforcing cycle that gets the engine of industrial capitalism roaring to life. This is really the synthesis of the whole chapter, where the argument comes full circle.
You know, the sheer elegance of this analysis is what's so powerful. You have one single historical act, this violent expropriation, and look at everything it accomplishes for industrial capital all at once. It creates the workers, it creates the market to sell to them, and it creates the material elements, both the variable and the constant capital, needed for production to even begin, and crucially, to keep going.
And that, right there, that completes the essential circuit. This process establishes the fundamental conditions, not just for a handful of factories, but for industrial accumulation on a massive national scale. The agricultural revolution wasn't just something that happened before the Industrial Revolution. It was its direct foundation. It provided every single piece that was required to get started.
So, all the pieces are now on the board. The workers, the market, the raw materials, the food, it's all been set free and is ready to be put to work. But this new world needs a commander, right? Someone has to bring all these elements together. And that sets the stage perfectly for our next investigation. The genesis of the industrial capitalist himself, the historical figure who's going to step onto this stage and set the whole engine in motion.